Major General Doug Laidlaw. I'll introduce him very briefly. Doug is currently, as you would all know, I think, on CFTS or ServOps-C in his current role as Head Joint Support Services Division. Doug's background is very much a dyed-in-the-wool reservist and from Victoria, CO of one of the battalions of the Royal Victoria Regiment, Commander 4 Brigade, took a leading role in response as the commander in the initial part of the response to the 2019-2020 bushfires, etc. So Doug has long experience and knowledge of the realities of reserve service and its challenges in civilian life. He is a barrister. He's foregone that career for a short period of time to be the head of Joint Support Services Division. And with carriage of this very important review, we welcome you, Doug, and we welcome your carriage of it and look forward to hearing from you as to the extent that you can, about how it's going to go. Thank you.
Michael, as President of the DRA and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen all. Look, my purpose today is to try and answer the mail a little bit, to give you some context around the review. But the review, pursuant to the DSR, is not happening in isolation. There's any number of lines of effort, you've heard some from Bob Plath and the like today, that we are engaged in, and hopefully at the end of this you'll understand something of our approach to it as a operating system, if you like, because there are so many of these concepts that are nested with each other and aren't all necessarily independent stovepipes. So today I will certainly touch on the DSR and where we're at with that. I will touch on providing the reserve context to the recruiting and retention work that Admiral Plath was talking about. I'd like to explain where we are with fleshing out and developing the Defence Employer Partnering Network. I will touch on the review of the Protection Act and employer support reform. So that's the scope. Before I go a little further, I just want to say this. Across all these lines of effort that we're engaged in, it has been so apparent to me that the demographic within particularly the reserve community is very much has the sense that we are in the moment here, that there are such weighty considerations and opportunities for us that to see the degree to which very, very talented people, very experienced people are leaning forward into this space. There's no end of people volunteering their time and their expertise to lean into this, and you should be rightly proud of that demographic, and that I have every confidence that they are going to help us do something with this and carry it home. Joint Support Services as a division, and without getting too caught up in the Canberra bubble and wide diagrams, I think you do need to understand a little bit about what this is. It's born out of the old CRESD and the Reserve and Youth Division, but it's huge these days. It was part of Joint Capability Group, as you've heard, now transferred under CPERS to the Military Personnel Organisation. Headquartered in Canberra, which is where I'm based, with elements all around the country, and as you'd expect, a total workforce solution to that in terms of full-timers, part-timers and APS staff. A whole bunch of directorates, currently 10, prospect of that even going out to something like 14. You'll see there, as I said, the genesis of the Reserve and Youth Division, so my ADF reserves in the employer support, area of special interest, but then the cadets and youth component. But what you probably wouldn't have appreciated is that we also have responsibility for the Joint Military Police Unit, and that includes the PM ADF, the Military Legal Service, Gender, Peace and Security, which is an organisation that runs the government's National Action Plan initiatives in conjunction with the UN, directives that we've signed up to, ADF Sports, and also the philanthropics support services, so think the Sully Man and the like, and an ICT directorate. Now, ADFRES, or ADF Reserve and Employer Support itself, what does it do? Well, they have roles in call-out to facilitate the functioning of that. They run reserve service protection. They run the Joint Reserve Working Group, which is a really important working group that you'll hear me talk about in a bit more detail in a moment. The connection with New Zealand, so we have a combined version of that we run with our Kiwi friends. Wing Commander Day, who's here with me today, looks after the international engagement piece, where we have a lot of time with our Five Eyes partners and NATO, and also the Defence Employer Partnering Network, which again I'll come to in a little bit more detail. Then, of course, there's the whole raft of the actual employer engagement and support functions, and you'll see them listed there. So the various awards, like the Employer Support Awards, Prince of Wales, the Boss X, or Boss Lift as it used to be known in the past, and various targeted and direct engagement as well. As an operating system, I'm not sure how well that slide will translate for you to read it, but how I've imagined this working on paper is effectively a hub and spoke sort of model. So that directorate sits in the middle and provides a coordinating function between contributing elements. And in particular, in this space, the Joint Reserve Working Group, where there are one-star representatives from each of the services, plus DPG and the like. We've got the Defence Employer Partnering Network, which 9 plus me, eminent people from industry across a broad representation, which I'll come to in detail. And in effect, how this works is ideas that might start in one forum, funneled through into the other for development and potentially back again. A contemporary example of this is that a task I've asked to be given to the Defence Employer Partnering Network is to consider what's been in the media of late, and that is how to manage conflict of interest in our senior reservists. So there will be out in industry various tools and methods traditionally of dealing with conflict of interest to get the advice to CDF, which is the function of the Defence Employer Partnering Network, about what those tools and management techniques might be. That work will then function or flow through ADFRES in my organisation out into the Joint Reserve Working Group for the services then to put their input and considerations, develop product, which might then go backwards and forwards until we've got something that we can actually work on as a deliverable. So that's the type of function that I see the DEPN being able to provide to us and to CDF. The DEPN itself, we have developed it in the sense that from its inception, it was not fully manned, fleshed out. We have now moved to that as a lot of people have rolled out of their initial appointments. In particular, we've targeted demographics of industry and our economy that coincide with our reserve demographic but weren't previously well represented. So emergency services, other government agencies, defence industry, universities directly, health sector, small business are all now represented on the DEPN, and that, in my submission, is a huge improvement on where we've been, because it more directly reflects what I suspect is the demographic of our reserve community. This is not the old DRSC. It is completely different to that. It's a body that essentially is appointed as statutory officers, if you like, to advise CDF, and you can see there from the operating model that it is about providing insights which can then be taken and developed and worked up into solutions. Turning now to the strategic review itself. Paul, you asked me the question about the TORs and where we're at with that. And whilst I need to preface all of this by saying this is pre-decisional, my boss, General Fox, has been engaging with the Minister with draft TORs. I can tell you that the draft TORs have been worked up in consultation with the mobilisation folk out of VCDF group, with the services. We started off with quite a long list of important things that we thought needed to be specifically addressed, but as that document has been refined and going forward, it has become broader in its statement, but importantly without any particular limitations or restrictions. So I think the easiest way to gain the sense of exactly how broad that review is going to be is to look at the words itself. So here we have several paragraphs out of the public version of the DSR. So comprehensive strategic review as part of national defence, and you can see how this all nests with the earlier presentations in the current strategic circumstances. Noting the benefit of where we've come to with the total workforce model. But here, this paragraph calls out that the reserve not only backfills or provides current capability in a peacetime BAU setting, which we do, but in particular, that bit about providing an expansion base for the ADF in times of crisis is more than a nod towards mobilisation and understanding what that looks like in extremis. And the task there, innovative ways to adapt structure, shape and role of the reserves. So that current TOR that's under consideration by government really reflects the breadth of exactly that. And when you go and look at the actual TORs for the Defence Strategic Review itself, which didn't extend to more than just over a page, I think the current preferred way of dealing with these is not to have a big long shopping list that you need to tick off, but rather to give the broad context, and that's where I see this going as well. So the themes, you'll see there, the focused concept as opposed to where we've been, the significance of mobilisation and all the planning and thinking that's going into that, the work around understanding what our current theatre mission sets are and what the reserve component will be doing in extremis to meet those, and linking the work that's, that the reserve reform might have to other DSR and government initiatives. An example of that is taking into account the government's current direction in terms of sourcing alternate ways of dealing with HADR, disaster type response, whether that be another organisation or whether that be better understanding of thresholds or what the solution to that might be, but most certainly taking the ADF back a few steps so that whilst we will always be there in extremis, that be given its proper context. And of course, the pattern of reserve service, which, you know, we need to understand the complexity here. There's a lot of green in the room. This will not be all about green. And the net effect of that is that the likelihood is that there's not one or a small set of answers to this question. It is going to be, I think, self-evidently a range of solutions that could well vary across service or even domain. We need to look at the bold initiatives in terms of how we're going to incentivise that to get the right demographic. And clearly, mass and scaling options are really what is at the heart of the outcome. Here's a graphical depiction of our ADF demographic. In the blue is CERCAT 6, 7 and SERVOP G, so they're your folk who are doing the gap year. In the red, your traditional or active reservists, I suppose, CERCATs 3, 4, 5 and SERVOP C, and in the green, CERCAT 2. So out of broadly about 100,000 folk in the ADF, you can see that proportionately we are roughly about a third or a bit more of the ADF. We sit quite comparatively to our nearest allies in terms of structure and size. So I'm going to flick through quickly a few to show you. So there's the UK with a Defence Force of about 190,000 and their reserve component a little less at 18.5%. There's Canada, very, I think, analogous to us. They're at 27 and a bit percent. The United States, starting to get a little bit bigger here, 36% out of their 2.1 million in uniform. South Korea, 54% out of their 1.3 million. And then you start to get into countries, if you certainly look at Sweden, Finland, South Korea, all countries with very immediate threat for understanding by their communities. And you'll see in response in terms of the scaling and where they think they need to be. So Sweden with 429 odd thousand and 73% of them being reservists. And then Finland, a small country, but yet with 279,000 in uniform, of which more than 88% are reservists. The reason why I touched briefly on that is that when we are going to look at role, function, and look at mass and scalability options, I think we need to understand the bit about strategic reserve, the bit about operational reserve, and the force design implications of what precisely government wants our reserve component to actually achieve in extremis. And then working back from there is all the complexities around how you create and incentivise and sustain that force. And as I indicated before, I don't know that there's going to be one or a simple set of answers to this. I don't come to this to the extent that I'll be involved with any necessarily preconceived ideas about what those measures might be. But I think that we are going to need to approach it with a very wide aperture to make sure that we have positioned those options for government to achieve the outcome. I opened up by saying that this whole process sits in amongst a bunch of other initiatives that are all linked and connected. So there's the work around supporting Admiral Plath's recruiting and retention team. There's a concurrent Reserve Service Protection Act review that I've started, and some employer support reform, which I'll touch on briefly as well. The input into Bob Plath's work is being conducted in the reserve context through the Joint Reserve Working Group, who have co-opted a bunch of individuals to help us around the nation conduct focus groups, which will be interviewing members of the reserve community starting very shortly. We would endeavour to be able to provide a report to Bob's team somewhere around October or November in order to feature into that review. The purpose of doing that, I think, has been demonstrated by some of the earlier discussions today, and that is all of us in the room as having long backgrounds in reserve clearly come with our own ideas about what it is that either motivates or sustains our people. And again, without solutionising that and noting that as was raised earlier. Again, it could be there's no one simple solution to this, and what works for one person might necessarily incentivise another, or what works in the context of ab initio reservists in Army wouldn't work for a Circat 7 transferring to Circat 3 or 5 in Navy or Air Force. But I think we could do worse than stopping and checking evidentially what that might look like in order to give some advice about those range of outcomes. This works in the sense that whilst the paying conditions and those direct benefits sort of attributes that we will advise up to the recruiting and retention team, at the same time, there's a bunch of triggers and motivations that will be relevant to the broader strategic review. And I've attempted to demonstrate that with a conceptual design here. I'd imagine your typical reservist has a Maslowian hierarchy of needs or motivators. It could well be that the sort of things that really motivate people to attend and keep serving is not so much about money, but more about purpose, like what General Tomo talked about, good training, opportunities to deploy, do the job, medallic recognition, and potentially for reservists, the paying conditions bit might come after a whole lot of that. And that lens might be completely different for a full-timer whose one and only career and way of supporting the family actually comes from that service. So it's possible that the priority of those motivating factors are going to be fundamentally different between the reserve community and the full-time community. As we do these focus groups, I'm interested in seeing if we can understand the broader context of what all those motivators might be. And at the top of the pyramid, I'm not sure if you can read the writing from there, but things like purpose, well-being, career, the personal development stuff that was talked about earlier, all of that we want to try and capture a bit, but that'll feed into understanding the broader triggers and motivators maybe that would feed into the DSR review. At the more tactical level, at about the paying conditions stuff is the remuneration and other benefits, and those things will directly feed into the recruiting and retention work towards that one line of effort. But the purpose of the slide and the point here is to say that they're all connected, they're not disconnected, they're not separate in the sense that we're going to achieve success through just one component of that or the other. I think it's the combination of any number of these. I'll gallop towards the end a little bit now. The Reserve Service Protection Act review, I've given direction that should occur in parallel with all this other work that we're doing, not in series. Or, you know, I think if we wait until 2025 to start that, we'll have missed the boat. It needs to be linked with what we're doing now. The breadth of that is not only to have another look at the actual words in the legislation, and I must say, and thanks to General Guard, we have a piece of legislation that is probably world leading in terms of its provisions and the protections it gives. But I don't think it's been well communicated. My evidence for that is the very few instances where anything that looks like formal action is ever taken under that piece of legislation. No actual successful prosecutions or have gone to trial, and many of the measures that are in there we don't tend to use. I'm concerned to think about, well, if we're getting serious about the road to mobilisation, what do we do with the huge proportion of our shared workforce that are also in other nationally important areas of employment? So your emergency services workers, or even, you know, in another circumstance, a transport worker, if our logistics system nationally is under pressure in a time of war. Any of these things at a moment could become nationally significant, and I think that just having a reconsideration around how and what processes we can use in an agile way to resolve those issues on a case-by-case basis where we are at risk of having to go to mass and scaling, and these issues will get thrown up more and more. And finally, some reform to the employer support payment scheme. So things that we were always waiving when we've called up people for fires and floods, for example, the 2-week qualifying period, we've now succeeded in getting rid of that. The compensator for that is some reasonable claim limits with carve-outs and appropriate exceptions, and doing our best to simplify the process and policy issues. And as a footnote, the average weekly wage at which it's paid at is just over $1,800 per week. So ladies and gentlemen, that's my quick romp through of a whole bunch of nested and connected bits of work that have been done through my organisation. As I said, you can be immensely proud of the number of very experienced people that are queuing up to contribute to this. And I see that we are very much in that moment of being able to make that contribution. So, President, thank you.
General, thank you very much. Thanks, Doug. I know the slide says questions, but given the constraints of time, and I think in many respects, if there are some issues that arise out of what General Laidlaw has talked about, I think we can pick some of that up in the discussion at the end in terms of that workshop activity as we try and get after what a broad framework around a submission might look like, or certainly those matters that we need to not ignore.